Anthropic recently updated their skill creator skill with a full evaluation and testing cycle. If you've been using skills in Claude, maybe Claude Code or Claude Cowork, or even just the chat system, you've probably got a handful of skills by now. But maybe sometimes they don't work quite the way you want them to and you're not sure what to do about it. Maybe sometimes they don't trigger when you think that they should. Or maybe you don't think about them at all. They just run when they run. In any case, I've got something to show you today that will optimize your skills in ways you didn't even know were needed. I used it for both an existing and a new skill, and I was blown away by what it did for both of them. But before we get into it, everything I'm showing you today uses the Skill Creator plugin from Anthropic. If you're in Claude or using Claude Cowork, go to Customize and look for Skills. If you don't have this installed, just go up here and search for Skill Creator. You should be able to find the plugin and just download it from there. If you're in Claude Code, just look for the plugins market. You should see the Skill Creator plugin right in the Anthropic marketplace. So wherever you're working, make sure you have that Skill Creator plugin installed because nothing I'm talking about today will work without it. So I have this thing I call my Notes to My Future Self database. It's not really a database, it's just a directory of files on my laptop that I use to store information that I know I'm going to need again in the future. It might be a summary of chat that I've had with Claude or another AI system, might be a recipe, it might be something about the house that I need to reference periodically and I just don't have another good place to store it. So a while back, I used the Skill Creator skill to create this skill to help me have a centralized location where I can just store things that I need to remember. I built it inside of Claude Cowork, and it's worked pretty well for the most part, but every once in a while it would save things to some random virtual directory, not actually to my laptop. So I felt like this skill was probably a pretty good test to test this skill evaluation and optimization tool set. Not really knowing what to expect, but I wanted to at least give it a shot and see what it had. So in order to get the whole evaluation cycle started, I just came into Claude Cowork and said, I'd like to use the Skill Creator skill to evaluate my Notes to Future Self skill. Luckily, it knew exactly what I was talking about. The first thing it does, of course, is it grabs the Skill Creator skill, and then it goes and reads my Notes to Future Self, the skill that I'm asking it to evaluate, so it can understand and get the full context of what it's going to evaluate. Then it gives you some feedback on what it sees the skill is trying to do. Then it goes on to ask you a few questions about what you're hoping to get out of the evaluation. This is going to be different for every skill because, of course, every skill is different, but it's asking if you want to steer the evaluation in a certain direction or if you're just looking for sort of overall benchmarking. And we'll see a little bit more about that in just a minute. In my case, one of the things that it noticed right away was that there was a hard-coded virtual machine path in the skill itself, and I had used the Skill Creator skill to create the skill in the first place. So that wasn't something that I did, that was something that happened during the creation of the skill by Claude for whatever reason. And so it can immediately see, well, that's clearly not right. First of all, those virtual machine paths shouldn't be hard-coded. But second of all, they're not available every single run. And in my case, I, of course, actually wanted it saved locally to my laptop. So right off the bat, it figured out one of the bugs that was inside the skill that I didn't even know about, but that was causing me grief. So then it went on to create test cases. The first one was saving a new recipe. The second one looks like it's updating it's a technical note that I might have stored for myself. And the third was sort of saving a home improvement project. It makes up all the data, it makes up the test cases completely, and any supporting documentation that it needs. And then it asks you if you have any questions or anything you want to change about it, and you can edit it there, or you can just let it go ahead and run. And then once it's done with all of that, it creates this evaluation for you to review and take notes on. So basically, it lets you look at the output from all of the tests that it ran, gives you the prompt, tells you whether it ran it with or without the skill, but it also lets you just go ahead and see the benchmarks, the results, the sort of metadata of what it found. In this case, everything passed, both with and without the skill, but the interesting thing was the difference in how long it took for the skill to finish. The with skill runs are slower, on average 20 seconds slower, and they use more tokens. I love the fact that it does measure tokens because I think we've all kind of complained about the fact that sometimes using Claude Cowork feels like it's just chewing up a lot more tokens than maybe like Claude Code or Claude AI. So it does give you that as real like hard data to take a look at. However, I did notice a problem. I was looking over the data and it ran, of course, with the skill and then without the skill. But I noticed that if it was running with the skill first, it was putting an entry in my index file and, the recipe was in there. And then if it was running the exact same prompt without using the skill and just looking to see if the result was the recipe is in my file system, well, it was already there from the first run. So it didn't seem like it was allowing for that or even looking for that. I noticed that across all the tests. So you do get to enter that into the evaluation notes. Then when you're done going through all of the test cases, you get to hit the big submit all reviews button at the bottom. It'll download an evaluation file. You go back to Claude and tell it you're done putting your remarks in, and then Claude will go find that evaluation file. Claude said, "Oh, that's a great point. Let me redo the test." So this is a really good example of where it really is important to go over the test results. This was not perfect right out of the gate. So after a little bit more back and forth and Claude rerunning the tests a couple more times, it was able to pare down the skill from 217 lines down to 52. One of the most important things was it found that hard-coded virtual path. The other thing that was really nice is I think part of my problem was the way I had been trying to use this skill. I would come back into Cowork and I would forget to mount my laptop drive to that particular session. So it was able to fix that inside the skill. It is now looking to make sure that drive is mounted. If it's not mounted, it asks me to give the session access to the correct folder. So that's actually already solved kind of half my problem with this skill. The other thing that it realized it was doing is it was creating comparison tables for everything that went into the database, whether it was made sense to be compared or not. If I'm evaluating products, it needs a comparison table. But if it's just storing a recipe or what size of furnace filter I use, there's no need for a comparison table. So it took out a bunch of stuff and made a much leaner skill. The other thing it realized was that the skill didn't even need to be called most of the time. The really important thing is the correct drive mounted? Once it is, the directory structure itself kind of told Claude what I was trying to do. So it really only needed to run the skill for that initial time if I hadn't fired up the session correctly. But if I went in and actually created the right environment for it to work in, it was able to do what I wanted without even needing to call the skill. I did test that after the fact and it worked great. So that's already saving me time and tokens. So I was really impressed with how well it fixed my pre-existing skill. All right, so that was a skill in Claude Cowork. I wanted to test it in Claude Code as well. So the first thing I did is I went into Claude Code, used the skill creator skill to create a skill I've been meaning to do for a while, but kind of kept never getting around to. If you've ever started a project and you have a PRD or a specifications document, you put it in the directory, and then you ask Claude to go create a plan and get to work coding it, you know that sometimes it misses something. So I wanted to create kind of a gap analysis skill where it would compare the plan for implementation with the original specification. So I figured I would just have it create that skill, and then I would ask it to evaluate that skill, see what kind of test cases it came up with. It felt a little bit heftier. So I wasn't sure what it would do with that kind of a skill. It asked me a bunch of questions about how exactly I wanted the skill to behave, and then it went and created it for me. But then came the part I didn't expect. The next step that it did was after it created the skill, it said, now let me put together some test cases. Here's 3 things I'd like to try. So it's already trying to evaluate the skill that it just built. Claude has really implemented this to be a full cycle kind of workflow. You go ask it to create a skill, it creates the skill, and then immediately it says, let's test it, let's evaluate it, let's make sure it's doing what we all expect it to do. So this sounded perfect to me, and it came up with some pretty good test cases. The first one was a simple web app PRD. The second one was an API heavy specification. The third one I thought was perfect was the vague specification without a solid plan. This was something that you might come in and just sort of on a whim, just sort of vibe code. I think the exact specification it said was, I want to build a recipe sharing app. I want to be able to share this with my friends and family and just kind of maybe use it on my phone. It was intentionally the kind of thing that was definitely not well thought out. So in other words, a very good real world use case. So I was really impressed with what it built. It built out the entire mock specifications, and then of course it built mock implementation plans to go with the mock specifications. It did a ton of work. I wasn't sure how thorough it would be able to test it, but in the end, it looked like it did a really nice job of creating the test cases. When it's done with its test cases and building the evaluation and the benchmarks, it lets you know it's done and that you can open the evaluation in a browser window. So once again, you get to go through all of the outputs and you get to look at the benchmarks, including how long it took and how many tokens it took. But something kind of interesting happened here. In the output from the non-skill version, I noticed that it was actually flagging things that were not missing between the PRD and the implementation plan, but actually missing from the PRD. So things that weren't really fleshed out, like if the user said, I need just an app for recipe sharing. Well, does that sort of implies a database or some sort of file sharing that implies login if you're sharing this with multiple people? And what is the cost? Are you talking about 4 people or 400 people? So it was actually calling out a bunch of gaps in the actual plan, not just between the spec and the implementation plan. And here's where the evaluator really impressed me again. It says that second point is worth thinking about. Right now, the skill explicitly tells Claude to stay scoped to what the spec says, which prevents inventing requirements, which is one of the things it was looking for. But there's real value in surfacing questions the spec should have answered but didn't, because those aren't gaps in the plan, those are gaps in the spec itself. And then it proposes the improvement to add a section to the skills output template for questions about the spec. Exactly those kinds of questions that I do tend to have because I'm not writing technical specs. I'm not even thinking about that sometimes. I am relying on Claude to answer those questions for me. So I actually needed this feature and could never quite figure out how to ask for it. But using the skill creator evaluator, I kind of stumbled my way into it. So this was sort of like a bonus skill for me. So at this point, it asks you if you want to make the changes that it suggests. I definitely did, and then it'll rerun the evaluations and you go through that whole process again. So once it made those changes and then reran the results, it came across something really interesting that I definitely hadn't seen before. The time it took for the process to run with the skill versus without the skill, it was actually faster with the skill. And Claude's best guess was because it had a given format to present the user, it didn't have to reinvent the wheel each time. It didn't have to figure out how to present the missing pieces to the user. And so in the end, in this case, running the skill did use a few more tokens, but it did actually run just a little bit faster than it would have without calling the skill explicitly. So then the third piece of this skill creator is you can optimize the description. This is so that it triggers when you expect it to trigger and that it doesn't trigger when you don't want it to trigger. So this kind of goes into that description that's in the front matter of the skill. So then it generates yet another report for you. It gives you a whole bunch of examples of what it's testing for, of what types of prompts it thinks should trigger the skill, and then also a whole bunch of prompts that it thinks should not trigger the skill, because you don't want the skill triggering by accident if it's a completely different use case. Again, you can edit these and delete them, turn them on and off, and add your own if there's something very specific that you're looking for. Once you're happy with it, you do that same sort of thing. You export the evaluation set, and then you go back and tell Claude Code that you're done, and then it goes and finds that file to see if you've made any changes, added anything, removed anything. So the results on this were kind of funny. It ran 20 queries and found that the skill literally never triggered at all. This basically is saying, classic under triggering, Claude thinks it can handle these requests directly without consulting the skill. Claude is pretty confident in its own harness to go over the results between the implementation plan and the spec, and it thinks that it knows best how to look for those gaps. So what the optimization tool does is it says, I'll go ahead and make the trigger much, much stronger. So now the description of the skill is going to say something like, always use this skill when the user wants to compare a plan. Anytime you mention anything about a PRD or a spec or a plan, use this skill. It also goes on to explain why Claude needs to use this skill, partly that there's a consistent output structure that it needs to follow, and partly that there's some other gap analysis that it's checking for, the gap in the specification itself. This to me was just like chef's kiss. I thought this was the perfect touch on a full optimization workflow. So I'm walking away very impressed with the updates to the skill creator skill. First of all, it's just testing to make sure your skill is actually doing what you want it to do. Next, it's making sure that the skill is even still needed, because some of these things have already been replaced by sort of native Claude functions. So that's really nice. And then the third thing is that check to make sure it's triggering when it should be triggered and not triggering when it doesn't need to be. Both of the skills that I used this on came out genuinely better. That first one fixed the hard-coded path problem. That was an honest problem for me. I was kind of losing data in some cases. So if you don't have that plugin, go get it right away because first of all, it's really helpful in just creating skills. But now with the evaluator and the optimizer built right in, this thing really adds a ton of value to your daily usage if you're using any skills at all. 10 out of 10, highly recommend. That's it for today. You know the drill. If you liked what you saw, hit that like button. If you're interested in more of this kind of content, hit that subscribe button. It really does help the channel, and I really appreciate all the new subscribers that have jumped on board lately. All right, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.